Today we have with us Professor Noson Yanofsky. He is professor in the Department of Computer and Information Science at Brooklyn College and at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. He has authored 3 books. Number 1, Quantum Computing for Computer Scientists, which came in year 2008. Second book is The Outer Limits of Reason, What Science, Mathematics and Logic Cannot Tell Us. This book came in year 2013. Third one is Theoretical Computer Science for the Working Category Theorists, which came this year. Today we will have an introductory discussion with Professor Yanofsky on his second book, The Outer Limits of Reason.
So, what is epistemology?
Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that asks questions like, how do we know things, and what is truth and what is not truth? Okay, so it's a very old branch, and it's a very important, but it's philosophy. And I tried to keep my book more scientific rather than philosophy. I love philosophy. I think it's important and interesting, but I wanted to make a popular science book rather than a philosophy book. Only because, and this is an interesting point, I think science gets closer to the truth quicker than philosophy. In other words, to 5 minutes ago, I quoted Aristotle about language. Okay, you would never quote a scientist that's dead 2,000 years because you know that their science is outdated. But philosophy, somehow it's you can still quote somebody 2,000 years and it's still true in some sense, whatever. So philosophy it's good because we get to truth, but I think Einstein and Bohr and Schrodinger and Heisenberg are closer to the truth than physicists of 1,000 years ago. Okay.
Sir, I would like to ask, why it is like this that most advancements which have happened in science, they are also demonstrating the limitations of the science?
Say again. Say louder.
Sir, my question is, why most of the advancements in science, they are also demonstrating the limitation of science itself?
No, I don't think most. I think just recently science has begun to ask, questions, deep questions about itself. But, there are a lot of parts of science that don't demonstrate limitations. For example, I spoke to a doctor a few weeks ago, and he said there's a type of cancer that used to hit children very badly, leukemia. Okay, and he said to me that nowadays leukemia is mostly curable. In other words, children don't die from leukemia. Now that's an advancement of science that doesn't show limitations of science. But we can now ask more difficult questions like, will we be able to advance all of science so that all of cancer will go away, or something like that? But no, I think what I highlight in my book is recent advances that show the limitations of science, but there's a lot more science that doesn't show the limitations of science.
So, sir, the question was actually, there is a maxim by John Archibald Wheeler, the great quantum gravity expert, that as the island of our knowledge increases, so the the shore of our ignorance. So he was asking like that whenever there is something fundamental in science, it also demonstrates a lot of things that are limiting. That is good.
Right. So, right, but let me continue with his analogy. The island expands only by the beach, the outside of the island, whatever. But it seems to me that science is expanding all over. The island is growing up, and the island's growing in the middle of the island too. But yes, as we reach more and more fundamental questions, it seems that what we don't know is highlighted, right? But I don't think all of science is pointing to our limits of knowledge. I just think some of science is.
So what we don't know or what we cannot know, in principle, fundamentally, no matter how advanced we get.
Right. Right. There's a quote to Einstein. I think it's in the book. It says that every time you answer a question, 10 new questions arise. And I'm not sure Einstein actually said it, but it's attributed to him. Right. So, but even that, just because a new question arises, doesn't mean it's unanswerable. Right. I mean, a lot of questions do get answered.
Sir, an example would be after the discovery of quantum mechanics, fundamental things like position, momentum, they are thrown out of the woods. Now you can't ask what position is, what momentum is. So these things that we took for granted, that these are things that science has to explain. Now these are things we never cannot know. These are only approximations.
No. We have to be careful there. It's not that we don't care about position and momentum. No, we do care about position and momentum. It's just that an object might have many positions and it might have many momentums. Okay, so, but that's fine. We're learning more things and picking up more things as we go on. So as science progresses, we don't throw out old concepts. What we do is we see them more in context. We see them more, better. Right. Anyways, right. So yes, we get more fundamental. For example, as science progresses, we thought that there was only molecules. Then we found out about atoms. Then we found out about protons. Then we think about strings. Then we think about energy. Then we think about information. That's all fine, but we still talk about molecules, right? I mean, we don't just say that they're unimportant or uninteresting anymore. Can I ask you, did you do this with any other book? Is this the first book that you three are reading together, or?
Sir,
This is the first one.
with one book about Indian history with a professor at Stockholm University.
Yes. What was the book called?
It's on India and Pakistan partition. Partition of Punjab and.
Very good. Very good. Anyways, this is a pleasure. Any other questions? Any other discussion?
So we want to talk about, sir, what is self-referential paradox, sir? Can you explain it again, sir?
Okay. So many times things talk about themselves and they negate themselves. Okay. Here's something I read last week. You ready? And this is just, it was a title of an article in the magazine. It said, there are some drugs coming out that can destroy drug resistant bacteria. In other words, there are certain bacteria that are drug resistant, okay, and these are killer these are killer bacteria. They kill people very easily, and there's new drugs that coming out that can destroy these things. But that title has a contradiction. It's a contradiction. In other words, if it's drug resistant, then this drug won't get to it. Okay, so it has this contradiction. Okay, the classic example of a self-referential statement, of a self-referential contradiction, is the sentence, "I am a liar," or "I am lying now." So if I'm telling the truth, then I'm lying, and if I'm lying, then I'm telling the truth. Okay, so that's an example of where you have a sentence, an English sentence, and instead of the English sentence talking about this is my phone, this is a pen, the pen is red, the pen writes well, those are English sentences about physical things. The sentence, "I am telling a lie now," is a sentence about itself. Okay, because if I am lying, then I'm talking about this sentence that is coming out of my mouth. If I'm talking about the sentence coming out of my mouth and I'm negating that sentence, I'm saying it's false. Okay, so that's a sentence talking about itself. And whenever you have such a contradiction, okay, whenever you have that self-reference, you can get a contradiction, and when you get a contradiction, you get trouble. Okay, and so that's a self-referential paradox.
So like how are we differentiate between say paradox and contradiction? We are saying like contradiction cannot exist, but paradox are existing.
Right. So a paradox is a way of coming to a contradiction. A paradox is a way of saying, look, if you believe this, you're going to get into a contradiction. So you better not believe it. You better not accept it. Okay. So again, this idea that there are no paradoxes in the universe, we use that. This idea that there are no contradictions in the universe, we use that to learn things about the universe, okay, using paradoxes. Okay, a paradox says, if you believe this, then you're going to get into a contradiction. Okay, so if every sentence is true or false, then the sentence, "I am saying a lie," or "I am lying," if that's true or false, you get into trouble. Because if it's true, then it's false, and if it's false, then it's true, and then you have a contradiction. So you have to be careful. So paradoxes are like signposts. They're signs that tell you, look, follow this way, and you're going to get into a contradiction. And you don't want a contradiction.
So like you said, "I am a liar" is a paradox. So sir, if it is how we proving like if we talk it in the sense of contradiction, like it is the second diagram you draw in with the physical world and another is mental world. In the mental world, it can exist. It is a contradiction. It can exist. So how means we are concluding that this paradox means, how are we relating this paradox with contradiction?
Excellent question. You ready? So, question. Where do I allow contradictions? Where do I not allow contradictions? Okay, so when I'm talking about language, I have contradictions. There are contradictions there. So the sentence, "I am a liar," that's a self-referential statement, and it's a contradiction. And it's fine. Why? Because I have no problem with contradictions in the language world. Okay, there are no problems in the contradictions in the language world. It makes sense to talk about contradictions in the language world. However, there are other self-referential statements that have nothing to do with language. They have to do with math and science. Okay, so let me give you an example. You all know about computers. Computers are self-referential systems. Okay, why? Because what does a computer do? It runs programs. What does an operating system do? It's a program that runs programs. So you have that ability to self-reference. Okay, and you'll see later on, we talk about in chapter 4, we have sets talking about sets, and that's not about language, that's about math. And we have about computers, and we have there's a cute line, it's funny, it says like this: a scientist is an atom's way of knowing another atom. Okay, it's a takeoff. They say as follows: a chicken is an egg's way of making another egg. Okay, so this is a takeoff of that. A scientist is an atom's way of knowing another atom. Okay, the point is that that's a self-referential system. Okay, we have human beings are self-referential. We're thinking about ourselves all the time. We're thinking about what we're doing. If I do this, what will happen? If I do that, what will happen? So we have that self-reference, and we can get into in certain aspects, we can get into a contradictions. In certain aspects, human beings cannot get into a contradiction. Let me give you an example. Okay. I want the beard and I want the girl. That's a human being desiring contradictory things, okay, which I can do. That's a contradiction that's legal because it's in my mental state, okay? But I can tell you a contradiction that's not legal. I cannot be in New York City and be in Bangalore at the same time, or, well, and maybe quantumly I can, whatever, but I cannot be in New York City and not be in New York City. That's a contradiction. Okay, so that's a contradiction about a human being that it can. Okay, the point is, a paradox points you to a contradiction. The question is, where does the contradiction exist? If the contradiction exists in language or in the mind, that's okay, because language and the mind has contradictions. If contradiction leads you to if the paradox leads you to a contradiction on the physical world, bzzzt, can't happen. Okay, there's something wrong with that assumption. Okay, we'll see more of this in chapter 6 when we talk about computers. I told you computers are a self-referential system, and they're physical. Computers are physical things, and there's no contradiction possible.
Sir, what will be our different methods for arriving at contradictions? Like one will be like falsifying method is there.
Falsification, yeah.
Yes, sir. And so what are like other methods also for reaching the contradictions?
What are the other methods for avoiding contradictions?
Arriving at contradictions. sir.
Arriving.
Arriving at contradictions. It's a good question. Well, I mean, that's the scientific method, isn't it? Right? So you have an hypothesis and you say, oh, I think this and this is true, and you try to do it, and then you get either it is true or you get a contradiction, and you say, oh no, my hypothesis is wrong. So you have to so that's another way of doing it. So right, so paradoxes are one way of getting to a contradiction, but there are other ways also. You don't only want to ask about contradictions, you also want to talk about limits. So we're going to see later on when we talk about, let's say, the traveling salesman, there are certain problems in computers that can't be solved in a normal amount of time. Okay, has nothing to do with self-referential systems. Just they're hard to solve. Okay, the universe is a complicated place, and it's hard to solve certain problems.
Sir, I want to ask you about a related thing. Some people think that the universe itself is a quantum computer. And if it is a computer, then it must have some computing power. Maybe it's too high, but it must have some limited amount of computing power. Does that lead to some of the limitations that we're talking about?
I guess it would. In other words, the universe is a finite place, and so it would. I talk about this in chapter 5 when we talk about the traveling salesman problem, and I say there's a certain problem will take trillions and trillions and trillions of centuries to do it. And then I say as follows, it's in the book, I say, if every particle in the universe was a computer working on these problems, it would still take trillions and trillions of centuries to solve. Okay, so that's a limitation of computers, even again as big as the computers, or it's a limitation of the universe in that case. I just want to point out another interesting thing. There's a guy named David Deutsch, who's one of the founders of quantum computers. And he says that a quantum computer can solve problems that a regular computer cannot solve. And he asks, how could it possibly be? And he somehow says that this proves that our universe is just one in a giant multiverse. Okay, whatever. He didn't convince me of that, but that's his idea, that the very fact that quantum computers can solve more than regular computers shows that there is a multiverse, and that they're all somehow connected. Again, I don't think many people are convinced by it, but it's an interesting point.
So you're talking about the many worlds interpretation of quantum
Right,
mechanics.
multiverse or many worlds, right?
Yeah. So can you explain it? What it is basically?
Well, it's the belief that our world is just one of many worlds, and the world somehow split up whenever there's a measurement. Whenever there's a quantum measurement, it doesn't make sense to say that it's measured this way or that way. There's a problem with that. And so there's this belief that our universe is just one of many, many, many universes. I don't, that's an old way of looking at it. I'm not a fan of it. I once asked a physicist if I'm anti-science if I say I don't believe in the multiverse, and he said no. It's still not officially part of science that I can say. It's just a hypothesis. It's not really true. It's not really been proven. So I'm allowed to disbelieve it and still be considered a scientist. If I came over to you and I said water is not equal to H2O, you would say to me, you're not a scientist. You contradicted a central tenet, a central idea of science, and therefore you're not a scientist. But if I come over to you and I say, I don't believe in the multiverse, you don't have a good argument. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I think I have to get moving now. This has been very enjoyable. So we're going to do it again?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sure, sir.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we'll talk about time later. Okay, take care. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, sir.
Thank you very much. Bye.